Thank you everybody for being here tonight. I'm very honored to be able to show some of the films that I've been making as part of my assistant professorship at NYUAD Abu Dhabi. A little bit about my background. I'm a biologist by training. I retired at a very young age as a scientist. I spent about a decade working on fruit flies, spending most of my days looking at fruit flies and decapitating fruit flies to study their retinas. So that was most of my 20s. And it was actually through my research and a lot of the imaging that I was doing in the lab that I got interested in filmmaking. I was very interested in microscopy, very interested in how we think about animals in research. And it was through the research that I became interested in embarking in film, not only as a filmmaker, but also thinking about or revisiting how we think about science cinema. As you know, a lot of science cinema has a cliche around it. We immediately think about science documentaries, National Geographic's Discovery Channel, or we think about science fiction, but we don't necessarily think about how science can be implanted in fiction, especially independent cinema and working scientists today. As you can imagine, a lot of the science that is being done today may seem like science fiction to many people, and you don't always have to resort to science fiction to have that impression of something feeling futuristic. And so it was in my PhD years, third year as a PhD student, that I started I launched an initiative called Imagine Science, which is a nonprofit organization that brings together scientists, filmmakers. So I started a nonprofit organization called Imagine Science, which is a nonprofit that tries to bring together scientists, filmmakers, and artists and have them collaborate together. And we organize a film festival that happens every year that just celebrated its 11th year in New York. It happens in many different venues around New York. The idea of the festival is also to change the venues and the way we think about how we watch science content and science imaging. So we show films in universities and cinemas and bars and cabarets, and it's an exciting initiative that we've been able to also bring to NYU Abu Dhabi for the last 5 years, as well as we also have a satellite festival in Paris. So this is one of the things that I do on the side is I run this festival and I try to get scientists to become not only kind of active participants on how we think about science and science in film, but also become filmmakers. I'm very interested in getting scientists to think about being the ones actually making the films and not only being the advisors to projects, which oftentimes will ask scientists to advise on a film and give their approval on accuracy and these types of things. So one of my interests is to get young scientists to start thinking about how they can actually get into this realm. Part of the reason for this is that video is becoming such a big way in which we communicate science. Video as a unit of information, as data, is becoming more and more apparent. If you look at a lot of science publications, they now use video. Many journals have video abstracts. A lot of the data is now presented as video and not only as images, and so I'm very interested in those aspects. I've been teaching at NYU Abu Dhabi for the last 5 years, and I have I'm very fortunate to be able to teach both in the film department as well as in the biology department. I teach science, I teach cell biology, I teach classes also in genetics, and I also teach film classes, a class called docufiction cinema. And in both of the classes, in the science classes, I use film as a way of teaching students about molecular biology and about genetics, where I have them make films and then talk about the films as a way for them to learn about processes that may be invisible to the naked eye, or maybe things that are very abstract to understand, but through the process of making a film, they take ownership over these topics, and then they can talk about DNA replication, and they can talk about gene modification, and they can become almost owners of this information through the creative process. So I've been teaching these classes for the last 5 years, and I've also been teaching docu-fiction, which is a class that explores how documentary and fiction can be blended together, and we look at many different case studies, from mockumentaries to reenactments, to many different types of ways in which we can combine those two in different types of cinema and different cultures, from Iranian cinema to all different types of cinema throughout history. So today what I'm going to show you are a few films that I've made over the last few years as a professor over there. I try to make a film every year in this region. I don't speak Arabic, but a lot of the films that I've been making have been in Arabic. It's somehow very liberating to make a film that you don't necessarily understand the language because you focus on other things, and it's been a really amazing way for me to learn about the culture, participate with other organizations in the region, such as the Environment Abu Dhabi Agency. I've worked also with the Louvre Abu Dhabi. I've also visited other of the Emirates, Ras Al Khaimah, Al Quain, and it's been kind of my exploration into this region as somebody that has never been to the Middle East before. So I've been making films since 2014, and a lot of the films that you're going to see tonight are mostly shot, or the crew, or the people helping making these films are all students, and also the people in front of the camera, for the most part, are also students. And my work, just to give you a brief context, my work kind of, as the class I teach, merges documentary and fiction, and I'm also very interested in animals as actors. And you'll see in a few films that animals are featured as almost having a voice in these films. So I thought that one of the ways to proceed tonight is to show you each one of these films, and then I can talk a little bit about the project. If you have any questions, I can answer those, and then at the end I can have a larger Q&A and we can talk about some of these films. Does that work with everything? I also want to mention before we start that I've been lucky enough to be here for the last few months, and I'm working on my second feature. My first feature is called The Fly Room. It's about the birthplace of genetics in New York in the 1920s. And my next feature, which is called Son of Monarchs, is about a Mexican neuroscientist based at NYU who literally and figuratively turns into a monarch butterfly as a symbol for migrant rights and as a symbol for open borders between US and Mexico. So we'll be shooting that in January. Maria is my producer. She's also an NYU alumni from the film degree department, and we've been very lucky to be based right upstairs, one floor up, the production base. And so if anybody's interested in being involved or hearing about that, the film is called Son of Monarchs and will be shot very soon, a little too soon for for my anxiety. So I'll start with the first film that I shot. This is a film that I shot in my first semester teaching there. It's called Return to the Sea. Okay, that's the first one. The main actor, Shakbud Al-Kabi, he was a freshman at the time he was taking one of my film classes. The cinematographer, Ko, was also taking film classes and became my cinematographer for the next 3 or 4 films, including one that I shot in Mexico a few months ago. And so it was delightful to be able to bring these students together and shoot these films. This was shot in one of the other Emirates. There's 7 of them. It's called Ras Al Khaimah. And this is a kind of a ghost town called Alhambra that I used as a symbol for Shakbud's brain and him having this lesion. And it was a beautiful kind of decor and environment to make this film. Since I didn't speak the language, a lot of the work in terms of building this film started with me asking Shakbud to talk about his childhood and talk about his memories. And then I pieced that together with translators and used that as the fabric to then start building the visuals around that film. If anybody has any questions, or we can wait until the end. Yes?
What were those letters on the wall? Were those like the DNA letters?
Yeah, exactly. So that was my kind of representation of him thinking about his DNA and his genome. And those represent, nucleotides and DNA.
About his mutation or about like who he is other than them?
I think it's more of a representation of his identity, of him trying to understand. And what I was trying to do also is, as he was exploring this town, he would go into different levels of magnification. So understanding his DNA, but also understanding the lesion. So having different levels of how microscopic he wanted to get in terms of understanding his identity. Yes?
The technology shown where his brain is being scanned, he's playing the notes on the piano in the symphony. Is that technology?
Yes.
It's extant. It's happening right now.
Yes.
Oh, cool.
Actually, they even have because I made another film about these this technology. They even have exoskeletons. They can actually basically these armors that you put on that are controlled by your brain, and you can have some very, very basic mobility, but you can use brain responses and decision making to be able to move different parts of your body. So yeah. Yes?
Question about the scene where he covers a hole in the wall of the computer. If you just kind of talk about that scene.
Right, so as he explores the interior of his brain and he almost tries to locate where the lesion is as well and tries to understand where that is. So that's him kind of going inside his own brain and trying to repair this lesion as a way of him, being able to, to kind of have this kind of rebirth to it. So that was the idea of that blood in that hole. Yeah. And that also comes in with, there's a part of it which is meditative, which is him also praying and all of these things. This is him kind of coming to harmony with some of the aspects that are happening inside. Yeah? One more question.
The final scene where he's talking about finally as someone hears me in reference to the sea. If you could just kind of talk about his connection to the ocean, I'm assuming it has to do with the sound the ocean's producing, or?
Yeah, I think it has to do with also this technology of him being able to have control over his body and motion. And the idea of music was a way for me to represent the ability of him not only having this motion, but able to kind of create sounds and having people understand him because he's kind of in this paraplegic state. So that was kind of the representation of through the sound, through the music that he creates, and his connection to the sea, having people hear him for the first time. And not only was it, for people to hear him, but also for him to create new scores and new sounds and build on that. And so that was kind of the progression of those things. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next one. This is a film that I made. It's called Guardian of the Mangroves. This is a film that I made for an exhibit on mangroves in the UAE. And it was part of an exhibit at this gallery in Dubai. There's this area called Al Sarqal. I don't know if anybody familiar with Al Sarqal? Raise your hands if you know. And I was commissioned by an artist to make a film about the mangroves. And I won't say much more, but we'll show it and then I'll talk a little bit about it. And this piece was actually shown as part of an exhibit, so it was like a piece that was played in a gallery space, and it was supposed to also be a piece that you could come in at any point of the story and kind of experience what this project was. I can talk a little bit about it, but if you have any questions, this will get me into talking about my work as animal perspectives. The next film that I'm going to show is about an oryx, a very special oryx, which is this beautiful symbolic animal that was one of the favorite animals of Sheikh Zayed, and I made a science fiction film about that. And so that will be the next one as we veer into my fascination with animals as actors and as voices that can talk about the environment and other issues as a way of diverting, or as a way of talking about things that may be censored or things that may be delicate. Have the animal talk about it instead. It's easier because you take the responsibility off of you and you have the animal speak for itself in a way. But does anybody have any questions about Guardian of the Mangroves? Yes?
Maybe you said it before, that's right. Is there any basis to the story?
Yeah, so there are these Emirati folk tales about a kind of like, Aesop's fables or Fable de la Fontaine, in France, and there's a monster called Fatou that protects the mangroves. And there was a book recently. A lot of these tales were revisited by students, Emirati students, that kind of incorporated it into modern society. And there was a few of these tales that were revisited and told through the voices of Emirati students today. And there was one of the stories that was about how the monster had actually decided to leave the mangroves because of pollution and because of the fact that they were destroying the mangroves to build these huge cities. And so I thought it would be interesting to bring back this monster and have people experience it. And there was one of the inspirations for this film was, I don't know if anybody has seen this film by Werner Herzog called Incident at Loch Ness. I don't know if, has anybody seen it? Yeah? Where Werner Herzog is filming the Loch Ness, and over the course of the film, the Loch Ness actually devours half of the crew, and then Werner Herzog is in the water trying to film this monster. And so I was a little bit inspired by that by that film as well. I highly recommend it. It's quite amazing. The film begins with him preparing the production of shooting the Loch Ness monster, and it starts with a scene with him and Jeff Goldblum and everybody having dinner and talking about them going on this expedition to make this cinema verite piece about the Loch Ness monster. Yeah.
What science says about these monsters and ghosts, do they really exist, or it is just a mythology?
It's up to you to decide. That was also part of the project. The part of the project was to have different people. There was no script, and I gave very few indications to the people that I interviewed. Part of the idea of it was to have everybody contradict each other on how they thought about this monster. And everybody had a different representation. Was it a female? Was it a male? Was it this high? Was it more human, or was it more monster? And so that was part of the work with the actors, was to give them very little stories and kind of use their own experiences and then have them visualize what the monster looked like. And again, this was a piece where I did the interviews first, and then, you know, if Shakbu told me about shadows, I would start filming shadows. I would try to match some of the things that were said to some of the testimonials that were happening.
Do you believe in those things?
Absolutely. I believe in that. Yes?
I came in late, but can you explain your relationship with UAE?
My relation, I teach there. I teach at NYU Abu Dhabi. I've been there for 5 years teaching. I teach in the film department as well as in the biology department. And I've been making films in the UAE since then.
So are you telling like the Emirati story, or are you telling your perspective hearing their story?
So in this case, a lot of the stories were incorporated in what the two Emiratis that were speaking about, their stories. A lot of those were inspired by some of the actual folk tales that were from the Emirates. Of course, my work is to then interpret it, and obviously as a director, I'm also putting my own kind of interpretation on it. But a lot of these interviews were not at all, I didn't really kind of script it or tell them what they had to say. The project was for me to make a film about how they were destroying the mangroves or some of the environmental impact of the mangroves, and I didn't want to make a film that was, you know, commenting directly about that. I was more interested in making kind of this film about a monster, and then this monster somehow decided to leave because of the fact that they were destroying the mangroves, and make something a little bit more subtle on how I spoke about these things. Also because I'm not from there, so making these docufictions and these kind of surrealist films helps me kind of, because I'm also a foreigner to the country in some way.
So was the non-scripting and the variation of their like experiences with the beast supposed to like reflect what they think protecting the mangroves is?
Yeah, so that was one of the indications that we talked about the Guardian, this monster being protective of the space, but also having kind of these characteristics that made it terrifying. So they took those indications, and some of them these were the two that I included, but some of them talked about this monster as being protective, some of them said that they were terrified about it, some of them said, no, actually it was just doing its own business and in that space. So they were able to kind of invoke their own spiritual and ideas based on kind of these ideas. And so even though it may be contradictory, they're also talking about the UAE and what the UAE means to them through their accounts of this monster. Yeah.
The accounts, are they real? Who wrote them? Like, do these people, like, I'm just wondering if this monster is an entity in the public imagination or whether it only exists in the imagination of this film.
These were folktales that were written in the 50s and 60s. So these were traditional kind of Emirati folktales that there is, lately with the UAE, there is kind of this necessity to revive heritage. And so a lot of these stories have come back and resurfaced. But they remain folktales, Emirati folktales. Yeah.
The cameraman, it appears to me that he has beautiful shots, but how did he get to there? Because some area are difficult to sit on it or to understand. Can you explain?
Yeah, I don't really shoot much because I'm terrible with camera, but most of those shots were done by me. But we were in a canoe on the danger of losing a very expensive camera. So, but that's how you get into those. And I was also shooting a lot of macro shots of the mangroves. So I will move, yeah.
Just a quick question about your research into bias, perceptual bias. It seems like you're exploring some of these psychological dynamics.
Yeah.
How actively or consciously are you exploring this in your preparation or in your development of these films?
Can we maybe talk about it? Yeah,
Sure.
we'll talk because that's like a larger question.
Yeah.
I think once you speak, because the next one is definitely very manipulative in
Okay.
how I have people. So the next one was called Insan, and it's about an Oryx that has very special powers. Thank you. I think I have one more film. It's only 3 minutes long, the last one. So if anybody has any questions. Yes?
So from my experience when I was in the UAE, they don't delve in the occult a lot, or it's not very clear. Some of these seem to touch upon the occult. How was the reception there?
Actually, it played in a few places, and a lot of people actually didn't. They really thought that it was an Oryx that could speak. So in a lot of Q&As in the UAE, I had people come to me and ask me where I could find this Oryx. But it was well received. I think that because there's such fascination and admiration, there's actually an island in the UAE called Surbanayas that Sheikh Zayed created this island to preserve a lot of the endangered species, and the Oryx being one of them. And the film began because a lot of Emiratis told me about a lot of legends, and they told me that the basis of the unicorn actually comes from the Oryx, and then they told me about that beautiful story about the black marks that it has under its eyes is for it to be able to see into the sun and into the future. So I was also interested in some research and an article that came out a few years ago in the New York Times about there's this gene called FOXP2, a gene that has been associated with language. Of course, language is very complicated and involves many genes, but there was an article in the New York Times about how they took the human FOXP2 gene and they put it into a mouse, and they were trying to listen very closely to see if it would vocalize. It's actually the first paragraph of this New York Times article. And they were trying to understand whether or not it had any human vocalization, and obviously it did not. And I worked with the Environment Abu Dhabi agency, who is involved with repopulating the Oryx. What's really interesting about the Oryx is that it became extinct in the UAE, but in the 70s they brought some of the Arabian Oryx to a few African countries. So they had to rebring their own animal back into the country because it was extinct, and so there's all these repopulation programs happening within there. So let me show you the last one, and then we can have more like a Q&A, a little discussion afterwards. I'm gonna skip one film. It's called Anthropological. Skip it. I can send anybody the link. But I'm gonna finish on a film that I made for the year of Zayed. This is the year of Zayed, and I made a film that kind of brings together Stanley Kubrick's 2001: Space Odyssey with Sheikh Zayed, and so I'll show you this. It's only 3 minutes. Yeah. It was a piece also meant to be a piece, kind of a promotional piece, and a piece that was played at a research conference in the UAE. And Mansour, the older actor, is one of the most kind of established Emirati actors there. He has an amazing face. And we shot, I think it was about 50 degrees Celsius. And we almost died on that shoot. So I don't know if anybody I don't think Alexis is here, but we spent about 3 hours trying to put the plexiglass into the sands, and we weren't able to. We were about to stop shooting because some people were about to die of heat stroke. So that's the behind the scenes there. But that's the compilation of films. I've done a few other ones, but films that I've shot over in the Emirates as a teacher there. And if anybody has any questions about any of those, yeah.
Can you follow up on the question that I asked you earlier
Yeah,
about
remind me.
Your exploration of bias, perception? You're a biologist, but I'm wondering to what extent you explore psychology.
Yeah, I think that a lot of my years as a biologist, I mean, I only did a PhD, calling myself a biologist is a big statement. But I think a lot of the ways I work with films, I treat them as experiments. So I think about, in the context of what I'm trying to get, or the themes of the film, how much information I'm actually giving to the actors. What's interesting about the UAE is that if you speak to Emiratis, they're very proud of their country, and in some cases, a lot of what they say can feel like almost like they're praising a lot their culture, but you're maybe not getting a lot of their personal, their stories. So I feel that if I were to ask somebody about the UAE, I may get something that's a little bit more kind of scripted, or about the country and about how they think of it, because it's a country that's only 45 years old, and many of the films that are made over there are very promotional videos about trying to get people to come and work there. And so that's one of the reasons why when I work with these actors, I try to stay away from from scripted material. But yeah, I think that I'm very interested in. One of the things that I mentioned is because I don't speak the language, it also kind of puts down the guard for them, because they can speak freely about certain things, knowing that I don't understand in some cases. So there's less of a self-conscious aspect in terms of how. Because I'm not understanding, so I think that's also been an interesting way in which I've been able to get some of these more kind of personal notes to the film. But yeah.
How do you go about selecting a location such as this one?
Well, there's a lot of desert locations.
Yeah, that's why.
But there's also mangroves. It's a beautiful country actually. We often think of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but the Mangroves is shot in this area called Point. It's actually one of the poor Emirates. One thing to keep in mind is that Abu Dhabi was a city of mangroves. Most of them were destroyed, to build a city. Saadiyat Island, where the NYU Abu Dhabi campus is a huge mangrove area, and so yeah, I'm very interested in films that deal with the environment and animals, and so I've been trying to not only shoot in deserts, but also shoot in these other locations such as the mangroves and Ras Al Khaimah, which is a ghost town, because when there was kind of the oil boom, everybody left these small towns and they became these deserted towns. And if you go into some of these houses, you still see plates on the table as if people just vacated overnight. It's quite an amazing experience to walk through some of these old towns that are basically made out of basically like mud houses. Yeah.
So are you already being in the UAE then inspired by the environmental issues that are there, or do you specifically want to be in the UAE for something about environmental issues there?
No, I think it's the first. I mean, I think I'm interested in environmental issues in general, and I think that I oftentimes use environmental issues and animals to talk about other issues, talk about politics, talk about culture. So I use that as a language. For example, in this film that I'm shooting in a few weeks, I use research on butterflies as a symbol to talk about politics, talk about, I'm using the wing of a butterfly as a way to talk about the border between countries, because we're doing these comparisons between how colors can be divided on a wing and how we think about borders between countries. So I'm very interested in the environmental kind of umbrella and this idea of almost like animal footage as a way of talking about other aspects. And in the UAE, because I'm unfamiliar with the place, I mean, I've been there for 5 years now, it has also been the way in which I've been able to learn about other aspects of the culture, is by interacting with environmental agencies and other places that have given me access, and through that I've been able to talk about other issues. So it's a place that's relatively difficult to shoot in, get permissions to shoot in places, but if you're making films about the environment, somehow they allow you to come in more easily, so yeah.
On that topic, so there's something about depicting animals and wildlife that you see as particularly useful to understanding the UAE in general as a country, or its people, or its culture?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about the UAE is that it sits between modernity and kind of these traditional values, and animals, for example, the falcon, the oryx, the gazelle, have this almost godly, stature in how they think about them. The falcon the gazelle, Abu Dhabi means father of the gazelles, that's what Abu Dhabi means. And the story is that it's actually the gazelle that found the water, the oasis where Abu Dhabi is. So it's thanks to the gazelle that they basically discovered water. And of course, in these countries, they both venerate these animals, but they're also destroying these animals. They're near the NYU University, there's a golf course where the gazelles hang out in the evening, and it's it's just an amazing surreal experience where they hang out like on the grass and then and all these things, and it's just interesting to think that they were the original inhabitants of this space, and there's almost a contradiction in how they speak about them and what's happening there. And so the falcon is also interesting because the falcon was used to hunt gazelles and other animals in the desert by the nomads, and now they still keep falcon traditions and they use drones to train their falcons. So there's all this kind of modernity meets traditional values. You'll see these little falcons that are being trained by these robots in the desert. It's a film that is in the works right now that I'm trying to make about falcon training with drones. But yeah, so that was something that I was very interested in, is how this animal, what is the collective memory of these animals, and these animals almost have the memory of the space from before, and what if these animals could speak? What would they say about this country? Would they be almost proud of what's happened and the accomplishments, or would they be critical? And so I think it's an interesting kind of way to talk about these issues, knowing very well that it's very anthropomorphic and obviously it's in a way very manipulative, back to your perception. I'm using the animal as a director to tell my own message in a way. So it could be considered problematic for some.
The United Arab Emirates have been very successful in obtaining the technology to turn the seawater into potable water.
Yeah.
And they've been very successful in turning desert into green. That's true. Can you comment on that?
Well, I mean, I don't think I'm in a position to comment. Yeah, of course, water is a huge issue right now in the UAE. There's a lot of issues about irrigation, about trying the oceans have really high salt concentration, so this has been a huge initiative trying to create You can't drink the water, tap water, because of the high saline concentrations. But water is a huge issue. There's endless highways with irrigation of water. They irrigate thousands and thousands of kilometers of desert to create. They have a rainforest in Dubai and things like that. So, but yeah, of course, water. There's all these technologies and initiatives to try to create potable water. So, yeah.
All right. What's the use of what was your? How did you intend to be using humor in these? Because there were some funny parts.
In which one? Because I don't actually ever intend to do that. Well, usually humor in film is when you intend to be humorous, it doesn't really. And sometimes you make something that is supposed to not be comedic, and then people laugh, and so it's always interesting to see how people react. But the last film, for example.
Yeah, for example, when he asked about how he thinks he looks.
Well, I think the humor is interesting because when you're talking about these big topics about can you turn the desert into green lands, you have to think of film almost as a symphony, and you have to think of it as when you have these very big statements, there are moments where you need a pause in those statements, and that's where humor comes in because as much as I'm talking about can we create the first city on Mars, switching to saying, oh, is that how I'm going to look like when I get older? I look like a handsome man. It allows us to breathe and it not becoming almost suffocating about these huge parables or metaphors about the future. So it's good to always have these injections of lightness and personal story with that. But I also improvise a lot with the actors. So a lot of the lines that come out of these are also improvisation games that we play between both of the actors. So. Yeah.
On that note, do you think science fiction is a really good genre for allowing audiences to fathom these big ideas because it kind of allows them to take a step back? It's not very realistic.
Well, I think that's the issue because there is science fiction that is realistic, and then there's science fiction that is non-realistic, right? So I think science fiction the term science fiction has many facets to it. So there are many films that are science fiction, but that are based on credible scientific facts, but maybe extrapolate or think of the future in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. Then there's a science fiction that is completely nonsensical and not based on anything. Yeah, I think science fiction definitely, there is also a lot of science fiction. Science fiction is based on the viewer as well. You may watch something about how they inject like the eggs of a butterfly, with solution, and you may watch that and think that it looks like science fiction, but it's not, So it's very much based on the observer what they consider to be science fiction or not as well. You may watch something and be like, oh, that looked so futuristic, and then you realize that it's actually happening in today's research. And then other people may say like, oh no, we've been able to do that for 10 years now. But yeah, I'm very interested in magic realism. I'm very interested in taking research and bringing it to the level where it feels magical, either in the way you visualize something, like microscopy always feels magical because you're looking at something so magnified. Like if you look at a butterfly wing up close, it looks like fish scales. It's just beautiful patterns, and so I'm very interested in almost caressing what science fiction is, but never going into like a futuristic depiction. But there's films like Gattaca, and there's other films that do a very good job in terms of foreshadowing what may happen, or almost like warning us of what the future may be like. But I think it's a very, film is such a powerful medium that you have to be very careful because it leads to a lot of stereotypes and cliches, and people form opinions about science based on what they see in film. Film is probably the most powerful tool. Of course, if people see your films, because I don't know if people watch my films, but but if you make films that are mainstream or they have a huge impact on how people think about science. So I think it's something that I think a lot about when I make films, and I'm very interested in documenting what's happening in research today. So yeah.
Are they worrying about climate change and seawater,
UAE?
surging and all that stuff?
You'll have to ask, I'm not an expert in those fields, but there's a lot of scientists that work on, there's a John Burt that works on sea level rising and coral reef, and there's many people. I'm just a simple filmmaker. Yeah.
I guess a similar question, like the consciousness of the reality of climate change, is that different there than it is here in your experience, talking to people, just, people?
Well, living there, you are very aware of it because it's like not a very, it's hard to live there. It's just very hot. I think, as I was mentioning before, there's a lot of, you're faced with a country that's relatively new. It's only like 50 years old, and there's a lot of push to have people come there, spend time there, and so obviously there's an awareness of climate change. There's conferences about climate change, but there's also a little bit of like reticence to speak about some of those things. But yeah, these are issues that are being spoken about, and the NYUAD biology research program is very focused on a lot of these issues. So. But I mean, we're aware of climate change in most parts of the world. So.
Oh, I guess I was asking, like, comparatively, and if the reality, as you allude to, is more harsh there, if that creates either like a greater in quantity or different qualitatively awareness of the reality. Is that?
No, I don't notice that there's a huge like a discrepancy or a difference in. Cool. Yeah, I feel like in my experience, it's pretty uniform in how these issues are being spoken about. So. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I've seen Space Odyssey, and I was wondering, how is it similar?
I had this idea of almost like a monolith, that like this monolithic structure. It didn't end up quite being that monolithic, only because it was falling apart and I had to put branches to it. But this idea of like a monolith that is timeless, that can kind of go through time and travel through time. So that was, but that's a good point. You always have an idea in mind when you make a film, and it doesn't ever come about as you ever imagined. But that's also the beauty of making film, is that the product is never what you originally intended it to be or how it's perceived. So.
When the younger looked through the glass, there were mainly just images of cities and renewable energy, but there were no images of nature or wildlife. And I was wondering if that was if there was any symbolism in that or not.
There was. I mean, there were at the end when it's on the monolith, you see kind of the mangroves floating around, and then you see a lot of microscopic images as well. You see crystals and things like that. So, so the idea was to mix, natural and artificial, and kind of have a glimpse. But I didn't want to have too many images because precisely that. I didn't want people to then start making. I wanted it to feel like a subliminal experience, because I didn't want people to then say like, oh, that's how he thinks about the future. The longer I have that sequence, the more people have questions about that, like the question you had, for example. So, but I tried to make it, kind of a mix between natural and artificial landscapes. Thank you.